Can pain actually help you on the weight loss journey? In my experience, yeah, it can. The truth about weight loss is it's painful. There are lots of aspects to this whole journey that hurt. There's the mental aspect and the physical aspect. When you're overweight, when you're obese like I was in pain. Literally, my back hurt. I would chafe when I would go to amusement parks. And there was the emotional pain too, that pain of feeling embarrassed about my weight. And the thing about pain is it hurts. It's not comfortable. And it can seem like pain is the enemy. But this book that I just recently read is called The Gift of Pain. It gives a different perspective on pain and just what a gift it is. And so as I was reading this book, I couldn't help but notice how much it applied to weight loss. Now, this book was actually written by a doctor, Dr. Paul Brand, and he was a doctor who worked in India with leprosy patients, and he also did a lot of work here in America. And what was interesting about his journey was that he went into medicine at a time when leprosy was a very misunderstood disease. People thought at that time that once leprosy came into your body, that it just made your flesh bad, and that you would lose limbs and things like that simply because the flesh was bad. But what he learned by working with these people was that actually it was that the bacteria from leprosy actually kills the nerves. It causes nerve damage. And it is the resulting inability to feel pain that leads to so many horrible effects of leprosy. So in the end, what he really came to see was that pain was an incredible gift to us. And when I was reading this book, I did start to think about how many times the most painful parts of the weight loss journey actually ended up being some of the best in hindsight. He gives the example of living through the Blitz in London and how scary that was. But, when he got space and time from it, when he was an older man looking back on those years, those were some of his fondest memories. And in the same way, when I look back on some of the hardest points on my weight loss journey, I realize those are some of the best points. Like when I really think about them, I'm so grateful. Like that moment when I got tagged in Facebook photos where I didn't recognize myself. In that moment, I was so humiliated, and it was very painful. It was a very painful moment. But then when I look back on that, it was like, but that's when my life really started to change for the better. And that moment really needed to hurt. The thing about pain is that it hurts, but pain is only effective when it really does hurt. It's supposed to get your attention. And there were definitely other points too when pain got my attention on the weight loss journey. Another time was when I finally got on the scale. At that moment, it was very painful to look at that number and to see a number that was almost 50 pounds more than what I was expecting as my worst case scenario. But it was also a moment where I really got myself into gear and really got serious about okay, I've got to get this under control. And that moment when I had my deadlift injury, that was another time where it was incredibly painful. But at the same time, it led me to a point where I started walking 6 miles a day as my habit, which is a habit I've been able to continue with for years and years now. And it also taught me some humility, because in that moment when I was doing those deadlifts, I knew I was pushing myself too far. I wasn't paying attention to the signals that my body was sending me, and then I ended up getting hurt. And just the discomfort of being overweight, those things like chafing or the back pain that was just from being overweight, those things, if they weren't uncomfortable, if they weren't painful, it would be really easy to sit there and not do anything about them. But because they were painful enough, that eventually did spur me into action. And an interesting observation he had was that it seemed to him that in cultures where there was very little suffering, they had less of an ability to deal with any kind of pain that a person came into contact with. In these countries where there were things like these terrible diseases, where people were truly suffering and many times in poverty, they could deal with the pain. But in richer countries where there was just less suffering, people just couldn't even handle a little bit of pain. So his idea was, it's good to kind of introduce some, I guess you would call it voluntary suffering, so that you can make yourself stronger and deal with pain, because pain will come eventually. You might have an illness, you might have an injury, you will lose loved ones from time to time. And so just learning how to make yourself a little bit more resilient is a good idea. And the way you can do that is by learning how to kind of have a little bit of voluntary suffering. He uses the example of when he was a kid, he was given an aspirin. He had an illness that he was going through, and he decided not to take that aspirin. It sat on his bed the whole night, and it was a rough night, but he didn't take it. And, he did suffer, but at the same time, he became stronger. And it was this point in his life that he could look back to remind himself that he was able to withstand pain. And he was a little bit tougher than what he had realized at first. And the same is true, I think, with weight loss. There are things that you are going to do voluntarily that are going to bring in a little bit of suffering. Things like fasting, it brings in a little bit of suffering because you will probably feel a little bit hungry, and that's uncomfortable. Or, things like having a step goal. It takes, time out of your day, and it's a little bit painful to, instead of sit around on the couch, to get up and go get your steps in. But that can make you able to just be more self-disciplined and to go through harder times more easily. Another really interesting aspect of this book was how he talked about the mental aspect of pain. The interesting thing about pain is it's something only we can experience. That our personal pain is what it is. And it's very difficult, if not really impossible, to really understand someone else's pain. And an interesting fact that he talked about was how 0.1% of the nerve fibers that are coming into your cerebral cortex are carrying new pain messages. The rest of the activity that's going on is basically just the nerves interacting with each other and trying to interpret the signals. What does this mean? And things like emotion play a role in that. And things like memory too. So it's interesting because in that moment, when you are feeling some pain, there's also the pain that takes place inside your mind, and your reactions to it depend on just exactly how you make sense of the pain. And there were some interesting questions, which I thought were really helpful on the weight loss journey. Things like asking yourself, do I want to recover? And that's a good question. It's like, do you really want to lose weight? Because so many times, when I would, start a diet or some sort of weight loss attempt, so many times I didn't really want to lose weight. I really just wanted to keep doing what I was doing. But when I really got serious with myself and I really decided, yes, this is what I want to do, then I found that was much more helpful than, kind of doing this halfway. I don't really know if I want to lose weight, or maybe I'm scared. I mean, that's another thing. Am I afraid? Because pain tends to ramp up when you're afraid. So if you can just ask yourself, am I afraid of weight loss? I mean, that was something that I actually was afraid of. I was truly afraid that if I lost weight, my life might actually get worse. And so it's something to confront with yourself. Another interesting part was his discovery that basically when a leper would lose, a finger or an arm, the thing that was causing it, at the time, the medical establishment thought that the flesh was just bad, that the flesh was basically just rotting and the limbs were rotting off. But what he found was that it was actually that the leper would get a small cut or a small abrasion on their hand or other extremity just by living life, those things that normally happen to us, and we just kind of, we shake it off because it happens and then we heal up really quickly. It was different for a leper because a leper can't feel pain in that area. So what would happen is the leper would just continue to hurt that injured place. It wouldn't take it easy. Like if you get a paper cut, you take it easy on that finger because it's sore. But when you can't feel the pain, what happens is you can just really continue to re-injure that spot, and then it will not heal up, and eventually it can lead to really bad infections and gangrene and losing the limb. And he kind of faced this uphill battle because the lepers themselves would say things like, well, it's just the leprosy. They didn't think that it could possibly be because that they had, had a paper cut or something like that. They thought, no, it's just leprosy does this. So they didn't want to try to investigate for themselves what was actually causing this. But he was able to convince a leper colony to really like hold each other accountable and to watch and each other and for them to point out like, oh, you just got a cut on your hand or whatever. And so what they started to see was that there was always a reason. And that's just like with weight loss. There's always a reason. There's always a reason the scale is not moving down, or, God forbid, the scale is actually moving up when you're trying to get it to move down. There's always a reason. And it's really easy, because I've done this, to just say, well, I just have a slow metabolism, or I have bad genes, and not to actually take a real look at what's going on, exactly how much you're eating and exactly how much you're moving and what your lifestyle is. And there was a really poignant question that one of the lepers asked Dr. Brand, and that was, how can I ever be free without pain? And I thought that was such an interesting question, because so many times, especially here in America, we're always trying to get rid of all the pain, painkillers. Every time, you have the slightest headache, pop a Tylenol. I mean, I definitely do things like that. So this idea that somehow freedom is linked with, pain, the ability to feel pain, it seems kind of like counterintuitive at first. But the more I thought about it, I thought that really is true. Like if you have no boundaries whatsoever, the physical boundaries are really important. Like if you ignore a sensation that tells you like, hey, this is pain, you can destroy yourself. I mean, you can destroy your body. Same thing with relationships though, too. Like if you don't have boundaries there, the relationships can be spoiled. So it's important to listen to pain and to say, oh, okay, well, I'm getting the pain signal and I need to pay attention to that. On the other hand, we can also be too sensitive to discomfort and pain and just to try to stay inside our comfort zone. But what I found is that, weight loss is all about leaning into discomfort, figuring out like how to do the uncomfortable thing so that you can get the results you're wanting. And there are also paradoxes that are within that. The idea is that sometimes there are things that are painful in the short term, but that can actually be really good for you in the long term. And I would put things like, having like some sort of exercise habit or, a fasting habit. Those are kind of, in the short term, they can be kind of painful, but in the long term, you get these really good results. On the other hand, there are things that are really pleasurable in the short term, but that lead to long-term pain. And those are really easy to do, but that can, of course, have bad consequences. Things like, just overeating or stress eating. Those are two things that are really easy to do and they are pleasurable to do, but at the same time, in the long run, it can lead to obesity and just a lot of stress that comes from those effects of being overweight. Another thing that I thought was interesting was he was talking about how the World Health Organization, the WHO, they put a lot of money into curing leprosy, and but they put no money towards. And this book was written many years ago, in the early 90s. But at that time, the WHO didn't put any money towards rehabilitation. So these lepers that were cured of their leprosy, they weren't contagious anymore. But at the same time, they weren't able to reintegrate with society because they didn't, have skills a lot of times, or there was a lot of public misinformation about leprosy. And that's similar to weight loss. There are so many times where all the focus is put on just reach the goal weight, but in fact, there's a lot of things that have to be dealt with either on the weight loss journey, but sometimes you don't even realize it until you actually get to the goal weight and you realize, oh, I still have issues, issues around food or stress eating or just overeating, bad habits, or maybe just trauma or things that you haven't really dealt with. So there's so much that you have to look at holistically, I think, with the weight loss journey, and instead of just only looking at that number. And so I thought this book was very helpful, especially because it kept hammering home the point that pain has to be unpleasant in order to do its job. And the idea of numbing out pain to just try to ignore it is not a good idea. It's actually pretty dangerous. And I certainly saw that with myself. I used food definitely as a way to numb pain. And what happens is this vicious cycle starts. You eat to numb the pain. And then what happens is that you gain weight and then you feel bad about that and you're more stressed out. And then you overeat because that's comforting, or, maybe it's just stress eating. And then you gain more weight. And then it's just this circle that's really hard to break out of. And it requires, kind of counterintuitively, that you start to do uncomfortable things. That, for me, that was fasting and being disciplined with my walking. But for pretty much anybody, no matter what plan you choose, it's probably going to be uncomfortable. And so you have to kind of choose your discomfort, I guess. And I gotta say, this book, I just found it at just the right time, considering the past couple of years and all that's been going on. It gave me some real good perspective on, even when times are hard and things are really difficult, you can still be grateful for pain and be grateful for all your circumstances, because they will make you a better person in the long run. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one.